Okay, I mean the news.
Hello?
Yo!
Can you hear me fine?
Yeah. Hit us up with your name, the shit you do, and your pronouns. Give us the goddamn... Give us the news.
Okay, hi, I'm Zoe Baker. I'm transgender, pronouns she, her. I'm a YouTuber. I have recently submitted a PhD on the revolutionary strategy of anarchism in Europe and the United States between 1868 to 1939.
Wait, what's your major? If you can get away with submitting a thesis on that.
I did a degree in philosophy at Cambridge, and then I moved on to doing my PhD in basically history and politics.
Jesus, okay.
So I'm an expert in dead white men with beards and what they thought about various things, and that's about it. Like with a PhD, you know a huge amount about a really narrow topic and nothing about anything else, because I literally haven't read anything else for like 4 years. I've just been like living in the 19th century.
Gotcha. Well, then I appreciate the fact that you know how to use Discord, I guess.
Well, I'm also a PC gamer, the most oppressed class. So
okay.
I have many skills.
So if I remember correctly, I've been aware of you for a while. You weren't following me on Twitter. Generally, if a person's not following me on Twitter, I assume it's because they dislike me, and generally that tends to be the case. But I saw the other day that you called me a, quote, fucking R-slur. You used an ableist slur against me, and then you said, this guy doesn't know shit about anarchism. So I was wondering if you could
sound like me.
I was wondering if you could clarify this incredibly heated language that you've used to describe me and my positions.
Well, so I'm much more polite than that. I've merely said I think you're wrong. But so I don't follow anyone on Twitter. So that's why I'm not following you or anyone else.
Gotcha. My ego has been assuaged. I was kidding, chat, by the way. That was a joke. Okay, so hit me up, or do you want me to like give you like my general?
Yeah, no, I can just go into it because I watched a video of yours that I had some thoughts on. So I've been studying Vaush thought before I came on because I didn't want to misrepresent you. So I've noticed on Twitter you call yourself a libertarian socialist, and then I saw your video on how to build socialism, and I was surprised that the main thing you advocated in that video was electoral politics, especially at a local level, in order to spread socialist ideas and win immediate reforms. Historically, the people who advocated that strategy were Marxists, who at the time were called social democrats, which doesn't have its modern meaning. It initially meant like revolutionary Marxists who want communism, and now it's changed to meaning people who want welfare states under capitalism. But leaving that aside,
I think I just want to say
I was confused.
One of my main frustrations, first of all, I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. Participating in electoral politics doesn't disclude one from participating in direct action or vice versa. So I feel like a lot of people, I don't know, they get really antagonistic about the idea of doing both. But my issue here, I think, is that I feel like a lot of lefties, especially lefties online, really, really understate the extent to which participation in electoral politics can be used as a vehicle to radicalize other people. Now, I'm not one of those losers who thinks that we're just going to vote in socialism. I don't think that's ever going to happen. But if you take a look at the 2016 election, you know, with Bernie Sanders or what have you, and I noticed this because I live here, the discourse, the perspective on leftism, the willingness to challenge institutional power massively increased as soon as Bernie Sanders, who was before just the independent senator, gave words to these ideas. And I think that's a more credible avenue for advancement than the idea that, like, a highly decentralized and sort of, well, I guess almost anarchic approach to radicalizing individuals ever could. Now, I think both should be done, but like a lot of people, they just seem to like, they hate the idea of participating in electoralism. It's very strange to me.
Okay, so what I wanted to say was, so first of all, I agree that they're not mutually exclusive, and historically, Marxists, who were called social democrats, did advocate both. The main social democratic parties in the Second International didn't just do electoral politics, they were also massively interconnected with the trade union movement and counterculture and direct action. They didn't just do electoral politics. But what I wanted to outline was the anarchist or libertarian socialist critique of these state socialist strategies. And my goal isn't to, as it were, kind of totally own you with all the facts and the logic in a Ben Shapiro manner, but more just give the reasons for why anarchists rejected these strategies, and hopefully give you and your audience something to think about, even if you disagree. I think it's really important that we look at the best arguments and think about things seriously, rather than going after the weakest ones. I'm not going to be arguing against voting for the least bad candidate. Historically, anarchists did reject voting for reasons that I'm not going to go into. But I think in current circumstances, I absolutely would have voted for Biden to get Trump out. I think we should vote for the candidate that we want to overthrow, not because we think they're going to make society a better place, but I would rather fight I'd rather fight Biden than fight Trump. So I think we agree on that. But what I wanted to talk about was electoral politics as a means to achieve a stateless classless society in the long term, as one of the means we use, as opposed to the sole means. I'm not aware of any historic socialist which advocated it as a sole means. It was always alongside other strategies. And so the anarchist argument was as follows, which is that, so to understand you at first have to understand what's called the unity of means and ends. And this is like a core anarchist principle. So I'm going to quickly read out a very short quote by one of my favorite dead guys with beards called Malatesta, who's an Italian anarchist. And he says the following: "It is not enough to desire something. If one really wants it, adequate means must be used to secure it. And these means are not arbitrary, but instead cannot be but conditioned by the ends we aspire to and by the circumstances in which the struggle takes place. For if we ignore the choice of means, we would achieve other ends, possibly diametrically opposed to those we aspire to. And this would be the obvious and inevitable consequence of our choice of means. Whoever sets out on the high road and takes a wrong turning does not go where he intends to go, but where the road leads him." So what is this saying? What it's saying is that the goals you have will determine the goals you have will determine the means you use, because you can use means which, irrespective of your intentions, lead to the totally different thing than what you initially intended. So, for example, I could want to achieve a stateless classless society, but then use the exact same means as fascists, and instead of creating a communist society, I end up creating like a totalitarian dictatorship where me and my friends are in charge, even though that's not what I set out to do. But the means took on a life of their own, and they transformed both me and social relations such that I ended up somewhere where I hadn't actually intended to be in the first place.
If I were to make an inference, I would guess then that your argument is going to be that whatever my end intentions, the use of electoralism to propagate socialist thought will inevitably set material conditions which lead to the existence of the state being central to whatever society is developed from those thoughts. That my radicalization will invariably, be central or be organized around the state apparatus.
That would be one component, but it's a bit more complicated than that. So
I don't have a doctorate, so you're going to have to grind it down for me a little bit. But please continue.
I'm trying to be as clear as possible. So to understand this, we have to understand how anarchists think about social change, and this is actually how Marxists also think historically. So they think that human beings have capacities, which are your ability to do things. You have drives, which are like your motivations, and these can be conscious or unconscious. And you have your consciousness, by which they mean just like how you experience and think about the world. And they thought that when you engage in actions, you simultaneously change yourself, you develop new capacities, new drives, new consciousness, and you change social relations. So, for example, workers go on strike. They, in so doing, develop capacities. Like now they know how to organize in a trade union, they acquire new drives, they want to stand up to their boss, and they change their consciousness. They now think that trade unions are a really good thing when before they didn't. And they've also created new social relations amongst themselves within the trade union that they formed. And this is called the theory of praxis, which Marx also believes in. So they then applied this to everything, including state socialist strategies. They thought, well, if what kinds of activity we're engaging in will transform individuals and social structures, depending on the kinds of activity it is, right? So like, if you're engaging in the activity of being a Twitch streamer, that's going to develop you in a way that's very different from if you're spending all your time like reading fiction or teaching yourself how to draw. And likewise, if a social movement is devoting all its resources and energy to, say, trade unions that engage in direct action, that's going to develop people in social relations in a different direction to if you're doing, say, trade unions plus electoral politics. So anarchists made two main predictions about, well, they made three main predictions, but I'm going to focus on two that I think are most relevant to electoral politics. So he made two main predictions about what would happen to the first Marxist parties which were established in parallel to them during the late 1870s, early 1880s. So the two predictions they made were as follows. Firstly, state socialists were wrong to think that they would enter the existing capitalist state, transform it from within, and use it as a tool to build towards socialism. Instead, what would happen is that the capitalist state, which is a hierarchical institution that perpetuates the power of the economic and political ruling classes, would transform them. They would be gradually corrupted by power, and they would come to be concerned with expanding and maintaining it rather than working towards a stateless classless society. And anarchists didn't think this would happen because socialist politicians would be transformed into evil caricatures. Like, I think Bernie Sanders cares about people, he has good intentions. I think the same is true of Corbyn, and the same is true of a huge number of historic socialist politicians. What anarchists thought would happen is that socialist politicians, given the right situation, would do awful things to preserve and expand their own power, whilst thinking that they were doing it to advance the cause of socialism. And that's because they've come to view themselves and their power as indispensable to the achievement of moving towards socialism.
Well, that's basically Lenin's entire history, isn't it?
Yeah, that is what happened to Lenin, it's what happened to Stalin, it's what happened to the Bolsheviks. And that prediction, I think, came true. And I've got some good examples. But the second prediction they made very quickly is that it's not just that socialist politicians would in general be corrupted and come to be concerned with perpetuating and expanding their own power rather than abolishing it in favor of a classless, stateless society. They also thought that what would happen is that you have these Marxist parties which are beginning with these programs which are explicitly advocating the abolition of capitalism. They're explicitly advocating the free association of free producers, which is one of the historic terms for socialism. So they're extremely radical. They're advocating gender equality. They're opposed to racism. Generally not so good on gays, unfortunately, but they do tend to generally advocate women's emancipation and are against racism. They're in favor of internationalism. So they are unbelievably super radical and progressive for the late 19th century. And what anarchists thought would happen is that in order to win elections at both a local and a national level, they're going to need to secure as many votes as possible by appealing to as many people as possible. And keep in mind, this is before universal suffrage exists, so there's like a smaller number of people who can vote. But they're going to have to appeal to non-socialists who would otherwise vote for Republican or liberal political parties. And the need to appeal to as many voters as possible would force socialist politicians to reduce their political program to very minor reforms to capitalist society. So these Marxist parties would then have to form political alliances with bourgeois political parties like the Republican or Democratic Party of their time in order to form coalition governments or successfully pass reform laws in Parliament. And then these alliances and all the compromises they're having to make would make them, over time, dilute their political program more and more until they're calling themselves socialists, but their actual politics are just about reforms within capitalist society, even though they began wanting much more radical transformations. Mm-hmm. And both of these predictions came true.
I have mixed opinions on this.
Well, I've got some good examples. So in France, you have socialist politicians who enter into the capitalist state. And these are people who'd initially advocated the general strike. So there's a guy called Aristide Briand, whose name I always can never say. But in 1910, he becomes Minister of the Interior. And he then smashes a French railway strike by arresting the strike committee and conscripting the railway workers into the army, which means that if they don't obey and end the strike, they'll be subject to martial law and then could be punished by execution for disobeying orders.
Pretty sneaky.
And they're established with a number of different socialist politicians in various countries, but the really big example of how electoral politics negatively affected these Marxist parties full of, genuine committed socialists who wanted good things is the German Social Democratic Party. So this was the largest Marxist party in the world. It received millions of votes in elections. It won a large number of seats in the German parliament. It makes, Bernie Sanders or Corbyn look extremely unsuccessful in comparison to what they were doing, while being much more radical and much further to the left.
And we know how this story ends, at least for a couple of the participants.
So spoiler warning if you haven't heard about this. So over time, they become increasingly reformist, and genuine revolutionaries within the party had less and less influence. And what this culminates in is that the majority of the politicians who'd been elected into the German parliament vote for war credits in 1914 and thereby enable Germany to enter World War I. Even though prior to this, the party had been committed to anti-imperialism and opposition to war, and claimed that they would, oppose any war were it to happen. And a few years later, in 1918, the new leader of the Social Democratic Party, he becomes Chancellor of Germany. And just as anarchist theory had predicted would occur, he proceeded to be concerned with maintaining and expanding his own power, whilst thinking he was doing this to advance the cause of workers. And this was achieved through crushing the socialist German Revolution, through far-right militias, and the murder of genuine revolutionaries who had been members of the Social Democratic Party, so most famously Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht.
Yes.
And then we fast forward to today, and what was the largest Marxist party in the world, which was the model for Marxists internationally in the 19th century and the early 20th century. Like all the Bolsheviks in Russia were German Social Democratic fanboys. They loved Kalkowski, who was the main intellectual of German social democracy. This was unbelievably influential and important as a social movement. Fast forward to today, what was the largest Marxist party in the world is now just another capitalist party. So both the main two anarchist predictions, which is that socialist politicians wouldn't change the capitalist state, it would change them. They would become concerned with reproducing and expanding their power. That prediction came true with huge costs to social movements and bloody state repression. And the second prediction was that over time, these radical Marxist parties would, due to the inherent nature of electoral politics, become less and less radical over time and end up cease to be socialist and just become another capitalist party. That also came true. There's a reason why today, when we talk about social democrats, we don't mean revolutionary communists and Marxists like we did in the 19th century. And that's because of the history of Marxist social movements themselves, where these parties over time became unradical and became capitalist. Now,
may I interject?
Yes, you can go. I've explained. I hope that was clear.
So I understand the premises, and I agree with them, I think. My issue, though, is that you can never finish a calculation until you understand both sides of the equation. And I'm interested in, well, a couple of things. Some key points that I'm thinking of right now. First of all, even if the participation of socialists in the electoral politics, even if that does lead necessarily to the watering down of their platform, it could be conceivable that their participation in electoral politics nonetheless served as a bulwark against fascism or against the conservative movement of their countries. For example, I know that in many of the Scandinavian countries, while it may then be true that the socialists of the early 20th century formed parties which are now considered social democrat parties, the country is much better for them, and they also serve as a handy means of radicalization, at the very least, against social austerity and, in some cases, against fascism. Obviously, that didn't turn out very well in Germany, because Germany ended up going fascist anyway, but that got, got complicated, and many people were at fault for that. Additionally, I wonder about the alternative program. See, for me, one of the big issues I have, this is something Marx said, the workers cannot seize the state, ready means. Essentially, socialism isn't just when the state is something that you control rather than something the bourgeois control. But the problem that I have is that all of this anarchist and socialist theory was written in a time where, generally speaking, you could take a block of people. You could take farmers, you could take factory workers, and given the right conditions, these people could live, they could meet their subsistence needs even without the intervention of the state or the corporations they worked for. Generally speaking, economies were local, economies were fairly decentralized, but nowadays, the global economy is so complex and interconnected that any attempt to, well, seize the means of production without seizing the economic structure that we rely on will end not only in unfathomable turmoil for the country that does so, famine and war and resource conflicts, but will also lead to us being so militarily weak that it would be ridiculous for neighboring countries to not take advantage of the power vacuum. So I guess my ultimate concern here is that I feel like we're kind of off on the wrong foot to begin with. We're fighting a losing battle. The more complicated the state and economic apparatuses become, the harder it is for us to achieve our goals. There's a reason why right now some of the most functioning examples of anarchism are in like, well, you have, the Rojava Project, for example, but these aren't modern first world interconnected geopolitically connected economies that are turning anarchist. These are usually ravaged areas that can do what they do because there was no pre-existing apparatus to destroy. But in America, I can't fathom any road towards socialism in America which does not involve some deft subversion, some subterfuge, a sleight of hand, where we seize control of the state apparatus. There are so many things that could go wrong if we don't. And the fact of the matter is that even for the most impoverished worker in America today, even for the poorest, even those without health insurance, the odds of their lives being made substantively better through some sort of radical decentralized revolution is incredibly low. The same couldn't be said of farmers or peasants back in Russia 150 years ago, because the relationship they would have to the consequences of a revolution was very, very, very different. Today, it seems like our only avenue forward, the best shot that we have, is to slowly and incrementally move our country to a position where the bourgeois, feel as though they need to enact anti-democratic countermeasures, whether that be some manner of a coup, or whether that be the revitalization of unions in this country, which leads to them cracking down. And that would be a flashpoint, a threshold that would allow us to meaningfully challenge them. Because if we can do so in a context where they initiate aggression, it seems like we could get away with enacting a lot of very rapid reform very, very quickly, without necessarily incurring the ire of the population and without destroying the infrastructure the people in this country rely on. And that's not even to speak of the benefit of opposing fascism as well. I mean, if we weren't to participate in electoralism, I don't know. Bernie Sanders moved the Democratic platform a good chunk to the left in 2016. If he hadn't, I wonder how Biden would have done this time around. If he would have lost to Trump because he wasn't even capable of emptily posturing towards social democracy, I wonder, Liberals aren't on their own really equipped to fight off fascism. It feels like they need our help a little bit. Anyway, those are my main points. But if you have responses to them, yeah.
Yes, so first of all, I agree with you that, like European social democracy, as in capitalism with a strong welfare state and some nationalization of industry, that's much better than fascism. And German anarchists who survived World War II, who had to flee Nazi Germany to not be killed like other anarchists were in Germany. Afterwards, in the late 20th century, they're like, no, this is liberal capitalism is definitely much preferable to fascism. So even they thought that.
I would have.
The second point is that there are lots of historic examples of movements winning immediate reforms solely through direct action, and anarchists was historically mainly a movement of trade unions engaging in direct action to win immediate reforms, and that was a core part of the strategy, where they thought that they didn't think a revolution was just going to happen and everything's great. Instead, we have to slowly build up a mass movement which is capable of launching that revolution. And a key concern for this was actually precisely to do with what you say about infrastructure and meeting people's needs. They thought that because of how complicated the economy was when they were writing, because this is during the first period of mass globalization, where you're having the development of, like our modern capitalist economies, they thought that given how complicated this is, we can't expect that during revolution everything will work out and we won't have, say, massive famines. And they were really terrified of this happening. And they thought, therefore, we have to create mass movements which don't just win immediate reforms like the 8-hour day, but also teach workers in large numbers how to make decisions, how to coordinate over a large area, how to live in a manner that is similar to the kinds of social structures which will exist in an anarchist society. And this is why anarchist trade unions like the CNT, which had a membership of 800,000 for quite a significant period of existence, and it goes up to the millions during the revolution in 1936. But this was structured as a mirror image of an anarchist society, not only because they thought this was a good way of organizing, but so it would prepare workers such that during a revolution, they would have the skills necessary to organize infrastructure, make sure production continues smoothly and people's needs are being met, so people, don't starve during a revolution.
But I would never disagree with any of this, though. No,
I'm just explaining, like,
based in pog-pilled to me. I mean,
yeah,
talking just hearing about it. But my concern, though, is how could we ever look to see unions and trade organizations come back in this country without changes to electoral policy? The Republicans and the Democrats are both pretty anti-union, but certainly the Republicans more so than the Democrats. And even then, a couple of reforms pushed through by social democrats or by AOC types might be an impetus for us to make meaningful movements there. Right now, unions are dead in this country, dead as they've ever been. I mean, they might as well not even exist, frankly. The idea of unionizing a workplace, like off the cuff, there are so many disadvantages you're coming into it with. It seems to me like if we're to make any meaningful direct action happen through stuff like trade unions, that we would need to rely on the beneficence of our masters to an extent, or we become those masters to the greatest possible extent.
Well, so historically, lots of anarchist trade unionism occurred in a context where trade unions were illegal, where trade unionists would be beaten up and tortured by the police, where trade unionists would be assassinated by hired guns by capitalists. Now, I'm not saying it's going to happen today, but my point is they were doing trade unionism in much worse conditions than today.
Well, sure, but people back then were cooler in general than us today.
But I likewise think that although it's obviously really difficult to just, rebuild, existing trade union movements, I think that it is possible, and we're in much less extreme circumstances now than people were historically, who managed to do a huge amount despite, much worse state repression.
Well, this is one of the. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interject. I'm really interested in this point, so I want to hammer in on it. This is one of the reasons why I think a lot of people believe this. I believe this as well, that the vanguard of socialism will almost necessarily be in the global south. Because it feels like right now in America, nobody's willing to make any meaningful concessions to their livelihood or to their well-being to advance workers' goals. But you have other countries around the world where people will literally fucking fight and die for the right to unionize. Nobody's going to do that in America. That's never happening in America. I support any measures taken possible to bolster the rights of workers abroad. And I think, and if they could do socialism, and if they could do that, and we could, I don't know, hold the CIA back to prevent them from doing what they do, I think that would be delightful. But in America today, like, we aren't going to have any, like, people fighting and dying for union rights. Americans don't even think unions matter. I don't think the average American even understands the relationship between, like, unions and wages. I think they just think, like, it's an extra boss you pay money to, So if I had to ask you, like, what would your route forward be in America for, like, affecting meaningful change, which would require I not advocate for participation in electoralism? Because I wouldn't disagree with any of the direct action stuff. I just wonder, like, to what extent do you think I'm harming the movement here?
So I think that first point is that there's loads of people in our society who are all doing loads of different things that result in the direction in which it goes in, right? There's multiple different social forces, and irrespective of what I, as a socialist or other anarchists say or do, there are going to be loads of other people who, irrespective of what we say, are going to be doing, say, electoral politics. They're going to be trying to push things in that direction. That's going to occur independently of what I'm doing as a socialist. So I think the question is, what should committed socialists do as a way to intervene within this ongoing social process that is occurring?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that historically, loads of the main wins, which have been won through direct action, didn't actually occur within formal like organizations. It occurred through mass disruption and social movements that emerged in response to ongoing crises or issues that people were facing. Where we've seen this, say, with the protests in America against police brutality, things get so extreme that an increasingly large number of people decide to take action in order to try and change the conditions under which that they're living.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think, say, like trying to build an exact mirror image of the CNT in 21st century America is necessarily going to be like a viable immediate strategy.
But that can only do anything if the leaders make those concessions, right?
Well, yes, like for example, when the CNT organized a massive general strike in 1919, which resulted in them being the first country in Europe to have the 8-hour day, and that was imposed on the ruling class through pressure from below. And that's why I think we should win immediate reforms in a way that builds the power of the working class, enables them to take direct action and transform their lives themselves, rather than learning to hope a politician is going to make things better for them.
Well, of course, but that's with a general strike. We can't do a general strike in America right now. We're not even close to being able to do that. The degree of worker organization and class solidarity necessary to coordinate that many people to strike, we're not even close to being capable of that. Right now, all we can do is protest, but protests don't do shit unless the president or whoever is willing to make concessions. BLM hasn't really achieved anything. And a lot of that, well, let's be real. If Biden was president, or if Hillary was president, it's not like it would have done much that way either. But protests, even historic protests, BLM, tens of millions of people participated in it. Like, we don't get much from that. But that's the limit of what America can do right now. Strikes. Now, if we could do proper general strikes, if we could have people hammering out the railways, if we could have people blocking trucks, if we could have people, not going to Costco to work, then we could get pretty much anything we wanted. We're basically the economic center of the world next to China, but we can't do that. And we can't do that because we don't even have the necessary preconditions to form any kind of worker solidarity,
But I think in order to engage those preconditions, the thing that should be focused on is trying to organize what direct action you can and radicalize increasing large numbers of people through that who become mobilized and participate in things. France, for example, has a much more, vibrant culture of rioting and protesting than, for example, in the UK, where the left is overwhelmingly focused on entryism into the Labour Party, which consistently fails. And I feel that obviously it's the case that protests often don't really change a huge much, because the ruling class can just go, well, we're going to ignore you. And if you get a bit too excited, we're going to repress you. And that's usually the standard response. Yeah. But when there comes a point where disruption is so huge, they are then forced to give in to concessions. And given that mass disruption is how to achieve things, I think that the focus should be on trying to build towards that mass disruption. And I don't think electoral politics will move things in that direction, where you can begin to have large mass working class mobilizations taking direct action. I think it will instead tend to result in people focusing on, say, trying to make the Democratic Party slightly less extremely right-wing than it is.
But if the Democratic Party is able to pass some policies that make it easier to unionize, or maybe protections to protesters. I mean, like Attorney General Barr was looking at sedition charges to BLM protesters. In an environment like that, we can't do anything. But the Democratic Party is weaker. It's weaker in the sense that it's not as willing to meaningfully oppose worker action. It still is, but not to the same extent. And it's also not as voraciously anti-union. If you work to get enough of them Justice Dems in power, just enough of them to move things around, a little bit of influence, you could conceivably get some reforms passed to unions, or even advocacy for the necessity of unions. I mean, I think that would be
I think the kinds
incalculably helpful.
I think, so, not all unions are created equal. I think historically the kinds of unions that big political parties such as the Democratic Party tend to back are bureaucratic top-down ones that are the mediator between capital and labor. They don't actually push class struggle forward. They, in fact, actively try to prevent workers from engaging in militant direct action.
What about Bernie?
And so, yeah, if you want to, well, I'm not necessarily talking about Bernie, but more like, say, the history of political parties in America in the kind of Great Depression onwards.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
they massively consolidated huge bureaucratic trade unions, which then meant there was much less militancy and much more kind of bargaining and less direct action than there had occurred, say, during the Great Depression, when a huge amount of it occurred outside of organized trade unions.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. It's just we only have so many roads in front of us, right? I mean, so right now we know we can't do a general strike. It's never going to happen. Look at what's happening right now in the United States with rent payments. We're going through like the dark winter. Nobody can pay their rent. The government is directly responsible. We haven't seen no Molotovs thrown. It's ridiculous. France would be on fire right now in the same, position. But here in America, like, we need something. Do you really think it's so harmful to try to promote the political advocacy of candidates who are more likely to support unions? I mean, Bernie Sanders, he didn't become president, so he didn't pass any union reform or anything like that, but he definitely got people more on board with the idea of worker solidarity. I feel like we have a long, long mountain to climb, but getting at least a little bit of a concession from the federal government is a necessary prerequisite, because right now we can't general strike. It can't happen in this country. So we have to move towards something that allows us to do that. And even if that means I have to be cringe and care about like AOC or whatever, I feel like that's very preferable to just like waiting around and hoping that in a century of constantly declining union membership that just something's going to up and randomly change, right?
So, if I lived, say, where Bernie Sanders did, I would vote for him just because I'd rather he have a position of illegitimate authority within a brutal capitalist state than another person. But what I think is that if you want to, if you have so it is the case that electoral politics can achieve certain reforms, although it tends to be the case that when they're not connected with large mass movements that engage in direct action, they don't. When they're in power, they basically don't keep all their promises. And Syriza, for example, was, a radical party. Loads of Marxists were involved in it. They are elected and then they betray all their campaign promises. So just because they get elected and there's a huge amount of resources and energy that goes into that election doesn't necessarily mean they'll then actually implement the things they've promised. And I just feel like all the energy and money that goes into something as large as a presidential election or local elections would be better spent on creating small-scale local organizing and direct action that tries to improve people's lives immediately, rather than as like a kind of long-term thing in whatever way we can, but does so in a way that builds the seeds which can then grow into what becomes this much more large-scale direct action social movement that can do the kinds of concessions that we both want and care about.
What seeds are you planting?
Well, so for example, if you look at the different direct action protests that's been done by indigenous people against the pipelines, or if you look at, say, the Quebec, or if you look at, well, often social movements lose, right, because they say brutally murdered, but you still should try. Or you look at, say, the Quebec student strike, where
I want to win, though.
Organized.
You say that a lot of energy.
Overwhelmingly, social movements lose of all kinds. They get murdered if they become too successful.
But I'm looking for a winning strategy here. So what you're describing right now, this like decentralized process of like direct action and stuff, like, come on, this isn't going to lead to a general strike. Like, I don't disagree with doing it. It's good to do it, and we should do it. And the pipeline protests were good, and they should have been done. But you talk about a lot of money and energy going towards a big election. That money and energy mostly comes from liberals. The way you made that argument, you made it sound like it costs $100 million to try to get a president elected. What if we put that all towards decentralized movements? The only reason they were able to win that $100 million or to raise that much is because it came from liberals who wouldn't be donating money to like local direct action efforts. So I really feel like from the left's perspective, the amount of energy and money that gets put into the electoral political process is relatively minor. And in the meantime, you talk about like direct action that helps people. I can tell you how many people were helped here in Seattle, or how many people have been helped in New York by socialists. Like, I'm forgetting the name of the socialist that's in the Seattle City Council because I'm a bad person, but she's been real good. AOC, the work they do does affect people's lives directly. The work, oh yeah, Kashama Sawan, thank you. The good that you do as a SOCDEM politician in this far right country, even if you make one minor change to some other bill or policy that was going to pass, dwarfs any amount of direct action that you could possibly do with the same amount of investment. I mean, Bernie Sanders running probably radicalized millions of people, at the very least, to being amicable to social democracy. Medicare for All is now widely supported by a large number of people in the US, specifically because of him running. Like, these are wins you cannot get through decentralized action. The larger and more powerful our country gets, the more, unfortunately, we have to rely on utilizing the systems laid before us by the bourgeois. And I mean, I'm not asking for like us to throw all of our weight behind presidential candidates. I don't believe that. Bernie Sanders didn't believe that either. He said, you know, it's not me, it's all of us. And I agree with that sentiment. But I feel like, I mean, for the amount of effort it takes, for the investment you put in, the potential for incremental reform to things like unions, which facilitate greater work down the line, and the potential to radicalize people using the soapbox of the electoral platform, these things are invaluable. And we know they work because fascists have been successfully using them for a really long time. They don't need collective organization the same way we do because fascism is inherently autocratic. But the extent to which the prominence of Republican politicians in media has led to the growth of fascism in this country is overwhelming. I mean, these people have a voice, you know? I don't know. I just don't see another route forward. I mean, you say put money and time towards local decentralized organizations. Feeding the homeless is great and all. I just don't know if that can be the bedrock for a socialist revolution in America.
Well, so I think so. And a good example I was thinking of is the Quebec student strike, where tuition fees were imposed, and there were politicians who made various promises who were elected who then didn't actually do those promises, that they would get rid of it. And what massively changed things was mass mobilization by students with support from people in the area who weren't students. There were regular protests against the police, fighting the police. There was huge amounts of disruption and direct action that occurred. And they had a really long-term plan of like gradually escalating things. They didn't begin with huge protests fighting the police, but they kind of built up to it over time. Once they'd won the sympathy of more and more people. And that was like a really important victory in a way that, again, I think like builds the power of people to of workers to change their lives.
Yeah, well, and Bernie Sanders ran and single-handedly pushed the entire discourse for the United States of America leftward. Like, even Republicans were sympathetic to some of the claims that he was making. For every symbolic victory you can point to from like decentralized worker protests or whatever, I can point to like much more empirically demonstrable benefits that we've gotten just in the past 4 years from people like the Justice Dems, just from people radicalized. We're fighting for hearts and minds, aren't we? I mean, it doesn't really matter where that voice comes from, but I'd rather use the biggest megaphone.
So I think it really depends, I think, on what your goal is, because it's like, for me, it's like I have a long-term goal of overthrowing capitalism, the state, and achieving a status class society. Mm-hmm. Now, if you just want to achieve European social democracy in the United States,
but I want you,
which is a perfectly reasonable goal, then yeah, I would absolutely think that one of the best means to do that is through Bernie and AOC and that kind of approach to social change.
What I'm advocating for would lead to what you want too, though, right? We need methods of building class solidarity in this country. It's a stepping stone. I don't think we can just up and jump to a stateless, classless society, but like...
Well, no one does.
Yeah, just...
So I think that if you're committed to that long-term goal, and then and if you look at what the kinds of ideas that Bernie and AOC are spreading, they've both said in a number of interviews, that capitalism is compatible with socialism. And often when they talk about socialism, they view things that historic socialists would have viewed as like extreme capitalism. a lot of the ideas that they're spreading, as someone living in Europe, which isn't as extreme as America's in various respects, this is like kind of like centrism within like some European countries, the politics advocating, but is like far left in the United States, because obviously it's like extremely right-wing country, and those positions, are really good and worthwhile, right? Like universal healthcare, wouldn't that be amazing if it existed in the United States? But I think that will be the limit of the kinds of ideas which are going to be spread through electoral politics.
What about just unions?
Well, again, like not all unions are created equal, right? Like I don't see them massively backing, anarcho-syndicalist trade union movements that are explicitly committed to overthrowing the state.
But
the kinds of unions they're going to be in favor of are the ones that tend to be a halt to that kind of working class struggle and end up reproducing capitalism, which is what's happened historically.
I'm only looking for that stepping stone. I'm only looking to use electoral politics as a soapbox, as a way of getting just a couple of minor concessions that could be useful to worker organization. I'm not looking to electoralism to give us all briefs on anarcho-syndicalism, from like a FCC broadcasts in between each program. I'm just looking for these minor bits. Like right now, we know for a fact that the material conditions in this country are not ones which will ferment revolution. Which will not happen. Even like, I mean, it was worse 5 years ago. At least now we have a populist sort of slant to some left-leaning politics. But back during the Obama years, or even further back during like the Bush administration, left-leaning advocacy in this country really was limited to like the anti-war movement and like a general unease with income inequality. Nowadays, there are people who talk about collective organization, and some of these people, a lot of these people, were big Obama stans just 5 or 6 years ago. And that movement to the left is purely, or at least in large part, a product of the fact that voice has been given to these radical ideas. In America, universal healthcare is absolutely a radical idea by people like Bernie Sanders or AOC, or even Yang, honestly. And I think these things are useful. Even if these socialists who enter the government, I do think Bernie's a socialist. I do think he's mask on right now.
He's hiding his power level.
Right, exactly. I absolutely believe that. But even if this means that he has to tone down what he says, or inevitably down the line his messaging becomes more diluted and he just turns into kind of a sock puppet, yeah. It doesn't really matter to me, because the effects of his advocacy are still real. And would Bernie Sanders have done more good for America running in 2016 and 2020, or running a soup kitchen in Vermont until like he retires at 98,
So I think the question for me is how, like, Bernie Sanders is going to be doing his own thing, and how can socialists respond to the things he is doing on his soapbox, giving very great speeches on income inequality and how corrupt the rich are. I think the response to that is try to use this increased consciousness that has been spread through Bernie and AOC and say, well, you like those ideas, check out these other ones which are further to the left, which are more based on direct action and these kinds of bottom-up social movements and prefigurative politics. I would want to use Bernie as an opportunity to push people to the left, to explain anarchism and Marxism to them.
Yeah, but that's what I believe.
And that would be the thing I would focus on. But it doesn't follow from that I think that that socialists themselves should be engaging in electoral politics beyond just voting for the least worst candidate as a means to try and kind of speed up that process. I feel like we should let the democratic socialists do their own thing, and we can intervene within the ongoing social process and try and push it left, given the situation that we're in.
If we can take advantage of Bernie's existence to radicalize people to the left, wouldn't it be to our benefit to materialize the conditions to allow that to take place again? I mean, even if it costs some time and money, if we could get Bernie 10 years from now, and we could get another big flashpoint that allows us to use their candidacy to radicalize people, I think that's probably worth the time and effort. I mean, however much money and time was put into Bernie Sanders, I guarantee you it was a more efficient use of money vis-a-vis radicalization than any amount of decentralized organization. So, I mean, if what you're saying is like, let the electorally minded socialists do what they're going to do and try to take advantage of it by radicalizing people to the left, then I completely agree with you. but I want them to keep trying. That's the thing. Because as long as they keep trying and failing, there will be more and more disappointed liberals that I can take advantage of. My audience is full of people who were big Obama stans and then got disappointed with electoralism after Bernie Sanders got shafted in 2016 and 2020. A lot of the people here right now who currently are full dyed-in-the-wool communists moved to where they are now because people like me, if not I myself, were able to, not to find a point in it, exploit their disappointment. I don't think there's anything wrong with that either. You should be disappointed. This country sucks, but I think that's a great process.
So historically, one of the main ways that people became anarchists was that they were initially trying to do electoral politics. It didn't work. Either the politician in question betrayed all their promises and just was extremely repressive, or they weren't able to even win the election, and various other things occurred. And then they became radicalized through that and joined militant trade unions. So there is very much a historical precedent for people being radicalized through electoral avenues being closed off to people, and they then think, well, what's the alternative? And they realize us acting ourselves through the power we have collectively as the working class.
Yeah, that's what I want with Biden too, right? Because Biden's gonna suck. Biden's already, Biden's already put in apparently Pete Buttigieg has been put as the for the Secretary of Transportation over the course of this conversation. Biden's gonna suck the whole goddamn road. But there are a lot of people who voted for Biden while hoping for more, and I hope that every time Biden does something stupid or reactionary or corporatist or whatever, every time he does something like that, I can point at him, and then I can point at Bernie, and then I can point at my channel, and I can be like, hey guys, yeah, he sure is a letdown, isn't he? Maybe if we tried something a little more crazy next time. And I wanna do that, and it's fun for me. It's because it's a really easy, I guess, jumping off point. I can't do that when somebody like Trump is in office, because all the liberals are going to attribute the death of the planet to Trump rather than to capitalism. So it's a harder sell. But yeah, I fundamentally, I think we agree. The thing that frustrates me, and this is what gets me, because I'm looking at YouTube chat, I see these degenerates, fucking 40 IQ dipshits, complaining about me. Wait, hold on. We can go over a few. This convo is super interesting, but Vaush is being so America-centric, just saying, we're literally talking about America. America's the country I live in. Fuck you. There were people earlier who were saying that I'm just a soak dem. You realize that, these are stepping stones. You move from point to point. You can't... Okay, sorry. I'm not going to talk to chat anymore. I just saw too many comments.
I'll need to leave soon, but I've enjoyed the conversation. But I just want to make one big last point.
Yeah, please.
Which is that, so you talk a lot about stepping stones, and just to bring back to the anarchist argument, is that what you think is a stepping stone will instead, as it were, result in the socialist movement sinking into this kind of metaphorical pond, rather than stepping onto the next stone and so on until we get to socialism. For the reason that I laid out at the start, right? Socialist politicians will be transformed through the exercise of state power and become concerned with reproducing and expanding it. And two, over time, they'll become, not concerned with revolutionary politics and become increasingly reformist till they just want welfare state capitalism. And we're even beginning at a point where, a lot of these parties they're not even starting out as really radical and then becoming just advocating welfare states under capitalism. They are starting out that way. And the reason why they're starting out that way is because they're the end point of a historical process that began in the 19th century with genuine Marxist political parties doing electoral politics. And the end point was those political parties abandoning Marxism and becoming reformist, rather than using the struggle for reforms as a means to build towards revolution.
Then let us not place our hope in these parties, but rather use them and the electoral process in general as a factory for misery and disappointment, so we can best exploit people's concerns for their elected politicians and move them over to the left. No? That's always something we can do.
So my position is we should persuade people who are disappointed and dissatisfied with the failure of electoral politics to achieve the goals that are very worthwhile, and persuade other strategies to them. And in anarchist theory, the idea is that the process of struggle itself transforms people and radicalizes them. So when people engage in direct action, or when they are attacked by the police, that isn't just something that happens, it's something that can also transform them. So they say, come to view the police as an instrument of the ruling class who isn't there to look out for them, who isn't there to solve crimes, but is instead there to repress the population in the interests of the capitalist class. Or they come to view direct action as a way of effectively changing the world. And that occurs through the process of struggle. And that's why I think it's really important when thinking about strategy to think about how it transforms the people who are engaging in it. And then when we then need to connect that with the long-term goals we have, which is a stateless class society, and think about how the means we're engaging in and the kinds of action we're engaging in the moment to achieve immediate reforms, to improve people's lives, can be constituted as far as possible by means which will develop people into the kinds of individuals who are both capable of and driven to overthrow capitalism and the state in favor of what was historically called the Free Federation of Free Producers, which we now call socialism. So that's my view.
But I would never disagree with that at all. It's just a matter of putting people in the proper conditions for them to be receptive to those distinctions, to be receptive to that.
Yeah, I think our only real main disagreement here is that you think that electoral politics is a useful way to create a situation in which other kinds of politics can grow through using the electoral politics as a way to spread more left-wing ideas and then change the kind of public discourse.
Yeah, at least a little bit. Well, here's my private belief, of course. My private belief is that none of this matters because in 40 or 50 years, climate change refugees are going to turn America into a fascist ethno-state. And at that point, we just need enough lefties around for us to not collectively get genocided. So that's my personal position, okay? I just want there to be enough people in my team. Huh?
I'm also scared of the ethno-state in response to climate change.
Yes.
So we share that fear.
Yeah, so that's my real... So for me personally, I don't think we're ever going to make it to a socialist revolution. I think there's just going to be a crackdown on people like us, and we just need to be big and strong enough to avoid losing that fight. That's my actual position. But whatever the case may be, I mean, getting people involved in the struggle, whatever leads us there, right?
Well, what I would say is that if you want people to be in a position where they're going to be able to prevent that ethno-state or even overthrow it if it does exist, is that they learn to have developed what anarchists historically called the spirit of initiative, rather than learning to put all their hopes and dreams in a politician who they think is going to save them. I think that can be a really unintended negative consequence of electoral politics. And even when Bernie is saying, we need to have a movement, we need to do things, unfortunately, a number of people will just put all their hopes and dreams into Bernie rather than learning to act for themselves.
You could look at my videos.
Take direct action.
You can look at my videos back in January and February, but I never put all my hopes in Bernie. I don't want lefties to put all their hopes in Bernie. I want liberals to put all their hopes in Bernie so they get crushed and their disappointment leads them to seek out more left-leaning ideas. I want lefties to consider Bernie Sanders like a fun coin flip, But a lot of people got really invested in them. And now you have a bunch of lefties that are running around like doomer mode with their shoulders slumped forward because they actually unironically thought that Bernie Sanders was like the fucking advent of socialism in the United States. And now that it hasn't happened, they're crushed, If that's what you're fighting against, then I agree with you completely because that kind of anomie is not something I want facilitated in my movement.
Okay, I think we will agree on some things and disagree on others, but I enjoyed coming on here and hope everyone who listened could, understand and follow along and that they thought it was thought-provoking. I have an article where I talk about this in way more detail called Means and Ends, the Anarchist Critique of Seizing State Power, where I lay, not all the arguments out, but like some of the core arguments anarchists have in a nice, clear, succinct manner that I recommend listeners read if they want to kind of think about this some more.
I'm sure they think positively of the conversation. And yeah, y'all should check out everything that Zoe does. Thank you for coming on. You said that the last time you'd been on a live stream was with Stefan Molyneux 8 years ago.
I debated Stefan Molyneux. It was like my first big trial as a YouTuber. I argued with him about philosophy, having studied it for a few months, while he was claiming to be like the greatest philosopher alive.
Yeah.
And I think I did quite a good job at owning him, despite being like 18 and barely knowing anything.
Against the greatest philosopher alive. That's a pretty, pretty strong...
He claimed to have solved like metaethics, which is one of the hardest disciplines in philosophy.
Yeah, I talked with him, and he said that the only reason the Industrial Revolution didn't happen during Roman times was because they weren't moral enough yet. They hadn't developed the moral fortitude to build the steam engine, even though they totally could have.
That is unironically an idealist conception of
history. He's a wacky guy, wacky little shiny-headed neo-Nazi.
Yes, he is very scary. But okay.
Be well,
I hope
and thank you.
the rest of your stream goes well, and goodbye.
Have a good one.
You too.
Oh, thank God. Oh, thank God.